But welcome to week one of photography and lighting. I'm so excited to be teaching you this year. I hope that you get a whole bunch out of this class and that it inspires you to use your time in such weird, unprecedented times in the world to take photos and make the most of your time at home. So, things you'll need. You're going to need a notebook and a pencil or a pen, doesn't matter to me. And you're going to need to have printed out your photography and lighting handbook. I sent a link in your email to the handbook, and I also put it in the Google Classroom in one of the posts for the Google Classroom. So if you can't find that, you can go ahead and email me, and we can get that sorted out. But let's go ahead and get started. Types of photography. You can either be reading along in your syllabus and handbook, or you can go ahead and just make notes on your own. That's totally fine with me. I don't mind either way. But first thing, what is photography? Photography is the art of capturing an image with the art medium of a camera. So just like an artist paints with paint, or an artist makes a drawing with a pencil, our art medium is a camera. And you probably already knew that, but thinking of it in the form of art helps our creativity to blossom. So the first thing we're going to look through is the types of photography. Now, these are just some of the most common. Types of photography are pretty much endless. You can photograph pretty much anything that is a thing, a person, a thing, an animal. They're all types of photography. So if there is a type of photography you want to do that's not on this list, don't be discouraged. You can definitely photograph whatever you like, whatever you're into. All right, first one, portrait photography. Portrait photography is taking photos of anything with a face. It's considered to be a portrait. So the word portrait, if you think of back in the era where people would sit down and get their portrait painted by an artist, same idea. It's just a photograph of something with a face. So if you take a photo of your sister, it's a portrait. If you take a photo of a family, it's a portrait. So portrait photography is just people photography. So that's my personal favorite form of photography because I'm a people person, but you don't have to do the form of photography I'm into. You can choose whatever you'd like. Next form of photography, aerial photography. Now, this form of photography is when you take a photo from overhead or from up in the air if you're in an airplane or a helicopter. It is mainly for taking photos from overhead. All right, so this one's a really fun one. If you have ever seen a drone, I know they're becoming more popular on YouTube. That's considered aerial photography if you take photos from a drone. So it's all kind of categorized inside of that. But it's usually used for taking overhead shots of things like marathons or traffic or buildings from really high up. It's just whatever you'd like to take, but just from a super high angle. Next one is action photography. It's usually used in sports sections or to photograph race cars or horses. Action photography is anything that has a super high amount of energy, and it's something that's going fast, something that is nonstop. Action photography is such a fun form of photography. It kind of coincides with documentary photography, which is photos of historical or memorable events. But this one's more associated with race cars and racing horses and the Olympics and things like that. But it's such a fun form of photography. Action photography is always something that is super exciting and fun. All right, the next thing, documentary photography, we touched on it a little bit. It's photographs of historical or memorable events. So when 9/11 happened and people took photos of that, that became documentary photography. So those are the photos that we see on the newsstands, we see them in newspapers, we see them on the Washington Post or online on news accounts. This is the kind of photography of things that are super important in to the whole world or to your country, your county. But these are just documenting historical or memorable events. The next type is wildlife photography. Now, my dad is a wildlife photographer. He photographs deer and turkeys and fish and things like that, but it's a popular form of photography that focus solely on animals. So your dog, that's considered wildlife photography, believe it or not. Your pet bird, the birds that are outside, you know, if you go to the zoo, that's all considered wildlife photography. If you take a photo of an animal, it's considered wildlife photography. It's a pretty fun form of photography. Sometimes it requires a lot of patience. So this one's a really good one if you want to practice your patience, if you want to practice being quiet and staying still. This one's a really good one for you. Next one is architectural or commercial photography. Now, this is one of the highest paying forms of photography if you want to sell your photos, but this is just taking photos of buildings or places that are super cool looking, or a museum, things like that. So this is when people take photos for selling their house. That's considered architectural, or they even call that, what's the word for it? They just call it home photography also. But it's usually just on a tripod taking photos inside of a building or outside of a building. That's pretty straightforward, and it pays super well if you can try and sell your images to the place that you took photos of. All right, next one, nature photography. Nature photography is usually taken for magazines or websites. Well, all of these pretty much are, or just for personal use, but they're usually of landscapes with or without animals. So this can be flowers, it can be a field, it can be anything like that that's out in nature. It can be photos of a mountain, but anything that categorizes under nature is considered nature photography. Now, there's thousands and thousands of things to photograph, but all forms of photography are worth considering. If it's interesting to you, it's worth photographing. So don't be scared to try something out just because it's not one of the main segments. All right, next. We need to go over file types and camera modes. This is like the basics of photography. This is something you need to know as a basis for everything you're going to do. All right. So cameras have two common file types. When you click your shutter button and you hear that click and you took a photo, your camera records it as one of two different kinds of files. The JPEG, which contains 16 million colors. That's a lot of colors. Every teeny tiny pixel on your camera, on your photo that you took, has a color. It contains a color, and it contains multiple different bits of information that create a file. A JPEG is a smaller file. It's usually the most common. On most cameras, they're automatically set to JPEG, right? So the JPEG is what you record it, you stick it in your computer, that's that, and you have your photo. The next form is called RAW. Now, you may not have heard of RAW before, but it is a much bigger file. It gives you more space to edit colors, to make photos look brighter or darker on a wider scale. This is for if you feel like editing your photos and making them look super professional. That's what I would tell you to use RAW for. I personally use RAW since I'm a photographer, and that really helps me to brighten up some of the shadows or darken down some of the highlights if I accidentally made something too bright or too dark. It also helps me to pull out colors that I saw in person that didn't really translate onto my photo. I can manipulate that a little bit more to make it look like what I saw with my own eye when I was photographing. But a RAW file contains 63.7 billion colors. Now, if you look at these two different amounts of colors, the difference is astronomical. From 16 million colors to 63.7 billion colors is just insane. It's insanity. So this is why the file is a little bit bigger than a JPEG. But once you finish editing or you finish working on your image in any way, you can always save it as a JPEG so that your phone can read it, so that you can share it on Facebook or Instagram. But I personally just like the RAW format because I have so many more options with editing my colors and my lighting. I personally don't like over editing, making it not look like something that I photographed. I just like color correcting, which means making the colors look like what I saw with my naked eye. So that's why I like RAW. But it's totally up to you if you want to use JPEG or you want to use RAW. I'm just showing you the difference of what you get with a RAW file versus a JPEG. Alright, next thing to go over. File types and camera modes. We're going to go into the camera modes section. Alright, the camera modes. Auto or picture mode. Okay, I'm sure that your camera has the auto or picture mode automatically set, but the auto or picture mode automatically adjusts settings when you take photos according to what your camera thinks is best. Automatically picks your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, and may even turn your flash on or off without you even telling it to. So this is what most people use because it's easy. You just turn it on auto and it does all the thinking for you. But the three main pillars of what makes a photo good is the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now if you let your camera pick that for you, you could end up with a photo that is a little too bright, a little too dark, doesn't have enough color, something like that. So when you let your camera decide, you take the guesswork out of it, but you lose the control that you have over how bright or dark your photos are. The next mode is manual mode. Now this is the mode that is used by almost all professional photographers. Okay, this lets you decide your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed yourself. You get to choose how bright or dark your image is. This is going to take a little bit more brain work for the first few weeks that you use it, but once you get it, you're going to be able to get perfect photos almost every time. As long as you are thinking about your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, you're able to do everything by yourself. You're able to control what your image looks like by adjusting the three prongs of photography: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. We're going to be covering those three next week. But I just want to let you know that it takes some time and lots of practice to get used to manual mode. Alright? I just need you to go out and shoot and shoot and shoot until something looks good. And then if something doesn't look quite right when you put it on your computer, go back and do it again. This is such a cool way to have more thought process go into your photos other than auto or picture mode. It could take you a little while to get the hang of it, or you might be a natural at manual mode. It took me a couple weeks to get used to manual mode. I either made it a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, but I got the hang of it, and now it's a no-brainer for me. There's one more thing that we need to consider before we take a photo of our subject. Usually we think, point your camera at the subject, focus, and click. That's it, right? Well, there's a better way to get a more beautiful image. Alright, so it takes a little more brain power, but you can do it. I believe in every single one of you that you can do manual mode if you put your mind to it. Alright, how do we take a more beautiful photo? Okay, next week we're going to cover the three prongs of a perfect photo: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. But this week we're going over the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds will change the way you look at taking a photo. When you put your subject in one of the thirds of your image, it instantly makes your photo more visually interesting. Alright? So the rule of thirds, we're going to separate an image into three pieces. So if you see, I don't know if, yeah, you can't see my mouse, but the photo is divided into a grid of 3 by 3, right? So we just divide it in 3 pieces both ways, and where the points intersect is our most interesting section of the image. Yeah, crazy, right? You don't think about how if you put your photo in one of these 4 places, if you put your subject there, it could become instantly more interesting. So this girl is in the top left third of the image. This kind of guides your eye from her eyes kind of down her hair, makes you kind of look around the image a little bit, but it always brings you back to her eyes. Now, with the psychology of the human brain, for some reason, the rule of thirds is more pleasing to the eye. So if you can remember to split your camera in 3, your camera might actually have a grid already in the viewfinder. Then you can create a more visually interesting image. Now, this is a photo that I took of my dad, okay? A very dramatic photo. We only have side lighting. You can't see his face. It's just a very dramatic photo. Now, this photo is interesting. Why? Because he's in the bottom third of the image, okay? So I stuck him in the bottom third of the image, the subject's in that bottom square, so that it would be a more interesting image, okay? Now, would this be as interesting if it were in the center? Not quite as interesting, don't you think? We stuck him right in the middle of the grid, and it's not quite as visually appealing, right? Like, this is just a photo in the dark kind of thing. But when you stick him at the bottom third, it creates a little bit of mystery. It makes you kind of think about the image, about why is he taking this photo? Is he a businessman? What's going on with this image? What does this mean? But the rule of thirds makes your brain think more than a photo that's just centered, right? So once you're taking photos, think about the rule of thirds. Now, it's called the rule of thirds, but it's not a rule. You can break it whenever you'd like. But it's more visually appealing if you stick your subject in one of the thirds. Now, we see this in movies. Now, his eye is at the top right third. His gun is at the bottom left third. It's kind of on the left third. But this creates a visually appealing look for movies also. So you will see them use this all the time. So next time you're watching a movie, think to yourself, are they using the rule of thirds? Where are they putting their subject? And I bet you'll find that 9 times out of 10, they're going to use the rule of thirds to their advantage to make their video and their cinematography more appealing to the eye. Now that we went over the manual mode, we went over the types of files, RAW or JPEG, and we went over the rule of thirds. So you can see it even in Ratatouille, they use the rule of thirds, even in animated stuff. You made it. You did it. You made it through week 1 of photography and lighting. I am so proud of you. There are a couple of optional activities in the Google Classroom that you can work on if you'd like. These are all just suggestions. You don't have to do any of this. This is just a optional thing. You can talk to your parents about if they want you to do the assignments or not. But I suggest you play around with what we went over today in class. So number 1, turn your camera to manual mode. You may need a Google search or 2 to figure out how your camera does that. Mine is a dial on the top. I just turn my little dial to the letter M, but you may have to Google manual mode and then the name of your camera. So for me, I would search manual mode R6, or I would search manual mode 5D4. You know, I would just search whatever the name of my camera is and manual mode, and it should help you figure out how to turn that over there. And then kind of just mess around with it and see if you can get a good-looking image by changing some of the settings up. Change your ISO, change your aperture, see what each one of them does before we discuss it next week, okay? And then I want you to try out the rule of thirds. Look in your viewfinder, look through your the part where you look through your camera, and try and stick your subject in the top third or the bottom third. Just stick it in one of the thirds and tell me if you think it looks better or if you don't. I would really like to know. You can go ahead and stick that opinion in the comment section of Google Classrooms, or you can send me an email if you don't agree with me and the rule of thirds, if you think it looks better in the center or on the side. But just let me know. I'd really like to know what you think of the rule of thirds. And if you want, you can try out changing your file format from JPEG to RAW. If you don't have a program that can read RAW, go ahead and leave it in JPEG. That's totally okay. But just as long as you know that the file size and the amount of colors that you're getting is 16 million compared to 68.7 billion. So if you can figure out how to use RAW, I would suggest trying it out. Let me know if you need any help with that. But I am so proud of you for making it through week 1. There's a couple of games to play in Google Classroom if you'd like. But other than that, I would love it if you would let me know what you thought of week 1, if there's something that you would like to change. But I want to thank you guys so much for watching through this whole video. Feel free to go back in the video if you didn't understand anything. But as for now, I will see you next week. Bye, y'all.